Our new story is A Wrinkle in Time. Chapter 1, Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the tree clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments the moon ripped through them, creating wrath-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else, on top of me, on top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School's all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg? I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to be a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she'd roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown down the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Denny's, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than they did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. A delinquent, that's what I am, she thought grimly. That's what they'll be saying next. Not Mother, but them, everybody else. I wish Father... But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where and when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. Why can't I hide it too? Meg thought. Why do I always have to show everything? The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there had been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown off the house and she tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked to have the attic bedroom, she told herself savagely. Mother lets you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane. It isn't privilege, she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the floor of the bed and then stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. Go back to sleep, Meg said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me. She looked at herself in a wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, barring a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse brown hair, so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What is he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly, she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she had heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on the back road as it was. And this time, maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to talk about the tramp at the time because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she had heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace rocking horse, the twins' electric trains. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into my twins' room, pushing again at her glasses as though she could help to see her better in the dark. Denny's was snoring, Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with the succession of B's and the occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games, and when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't weren't made about Sandy and Denny's. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs. Avoiding creaking the seventh step, Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come? Suppose he has a knife? Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up, and if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable, sitting there alone in the big, old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. Hi, he said cheerfully. I've been waiting for you. From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender, dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Lillian setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own. Why didn't you come up to the attic? Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. I've been scared stiff. Too windy up in the attic of yours, the little boy said. I know I'd be down. I'd put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now. How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew or seemed to care what Denny's and Sandy were thinking. It was his mother's mind and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children, Meg had once overheard. The 2 boys seem to be nice regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there. It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learn to talk, and it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg, her father had once told her back in the day. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away.